All right, welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going to get into something really interesting, I think. The world of crime.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be using, as our source material, the crime book. Big ideas simply explained. And it's not just a list of famous criminals or anything like that. We're going to try to understand why we as humans are so fascinated by crime, how criminal activities changed over time, and really what these stories tell us about ourselves.
And it's a journey that takes us to some dark places because even the crimes, I think, that kind of make us recoil the most, the ones we just find repulsive, we're still drawn to them.
Yeah, that's what the book says right from the start. Even offenses that disgust us, it says, such as rape, domestic abuse, theft from charities, preying on the elderly, or child abuse, hold us as much in thrall as other seemingly more glamorous ones. So why is that? Why are we so fascinated by crime? Even the dark stuff.
I mean, that's a question that, has plagued psychologists and criminologists for ages. I mean, some think it's primal, a way to learn about potential threats and to protect ourselves. Others say it's about a desire for justice, this need to see wrongs righted, but it's probably a pretty complex mix of different things.
Okay, so we want to understand it, but the book also points out that what's actually a crime can change a lot. I mean, privateering, that was actually legal at one point, right?
Yeah, privateering is a perfect example of how the definition of a crime can really shift over time. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, governments would issue these things called letters of marque, basically licenses for private ships to attack and capture enemy vessels. So during war, it was seen as a patriotic duty. But as soon as peace treaties were signed, it became a crime.
So they went from heroes to criminals just like that, huh?
Pretty much, yeah.
Makes you think, what things that we think are perfectly normal today might be crimes in the future?
Right, absolutely. I mean, just look at technology and how quickly everything is changing. What we think of as cybercrime now could be totally different as technology continues to evolve.
Right, and the book compares the great train robbery of 1963 to modern-day hacking. Back then you had to have a group of guys, they held up a train, they stole millions. Now someone like Alexander Panin, he can just steal information from millions of computers without ever leaving his chair.
And that shift in, the way crimes are committed, it's been driven by technology. But it's also changed how we investigate crime. I mean, forensic science has come a long way from the early days.
Yeah, the book talks about the Stratton brothers case in 1905. It was one of the first murder convictions in the UK based on fingerprints. Just a fingerprint.
Yeah, it was a huge breakthrough at the time.
Wow.
But, these days, we've got DNA analysis. It's like something out of science fiction. And the book uses the Colin Pitchfork case to show how DNA can be used to conclusively link someone to a crime scene.
So we've gone from fingerprints to DNA. That's pretty incredible. But even with all of these advances in forensic science, people are still fascinated by certain criminals, especially the ones who operate outside the law. The book talks about, the idea of the outlaw, particularly in the American West.
Yeah, people like Jesse James and Bonnie and Clyde, they've almost become like folk heroes, right? Their stories are romanticized in movies and books, but we have to remember, they were criminals. They committed violent acts. And the book makes that clear. Their actions caused real suffering.
It's true. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of these stories, the rebellion, going against the system. But it's important, I think, to remember the victims, the people who are actually hurt by these outlaws' actions.
Yeah, for sure. I think we need to view those figures with a critical eye, understand the context of their actions, the consequences that came with it. We can find their stories intriguing, but still condemn their behavior.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we've talked about, the definition of crime changing, the evolution of how crimes are committed and investigated, and even this sort of romantic idea of the outlaw. But what about the psychology of it all? What makes someone commit a crime? Is it something in their personality? Or is it outside factors?
Well, the book goes into the whole area of criminal psychology, and it looks specifically at psychopathy. It's a complex condition, characterized by this lack of empathy, remorse, and disregard for norms.
Yeah, and when we hear psychopath, we think of Hannibal Lecter or something. But the book uses real-life cases like Burke and Hare to show just how real, how scary psychopathy can be.
Burke and Hare, they were notorious for these murders in Edinburgh back in the 19th century, where they would kill people and sell their bodies to these anatomy schools. Their case really highlights the callous, exploitative nature of psychopathy.
It's a chilling example for sure. And the book also talks about the Hare psychopathy checklist, which is used to assess those traits. So is that like a way to tell who is going to be a criminal?
Well, not really. I mean, it's not a crystal ball, but it is used by mental health professionals to assess the presence and severity of psychopathic traits. It gives us insights, right, into personality and potential risks.
Okay, so it's not predicting the future, but it's a tool for understanding that darker side of human nature. And the book, it introduces this whole range of like criminal archetypes, different kinds of criminals.
Exactly. It gets much more specific than just the idea of a criminal, and it looks at the different skills, motivations, and kind of breaks them down into categories. You've got the con artist, for example, who relies on deception and manipulation.
Yeah, and the book tells the story of Jeanne de la Motte and the affair of the diamond necklace. I mean, this woman convinced people she was acting on behalf of the Queen of France to get this incredibly expensive diamond necklace. Talk about audacity.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that takes skill. And then you've got the master thief like John Jack McLean, who's described as a real-life super thief. He targeted the wealthy, pulling off these elaborate heists.
Sounds like a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
And then there's the art forger, someone who uses their artistic talent to create these fake masterpieces that fool the experts.
Right. The book highlights Elmer de Horry, whose forgeries fooled some of the biggest names in the art world. And his story raises questions about the nature of art itself, authenticity, the value we place on originals versus copies.
It makes you think. So we've got these individual con artists, thieves, forgers. But what about when it's not just one person? When it's a large-scale criminal enterprise? That's where we get into white-collar crime.
Right. White-collar crime, as the book defines it, is usually nonviolent. It's about money, involving deception, fraud, manipulation of systems for personal gain.
The book uses the classic example of Charles Ponzi, whose scheme promised investors ridiculous returns, but was just this massive fraud that collapsed and left people ruined.
And then there's the Teapot Dome scandal, which exposed corruption at the highest levels of government. Greed and abuse of power, it can happen anywhere.
And of course, you can't forget about corporate crime, like Enron, which the book also talks about. I mean, the collapse of Enron, it hurt employees, investors, the whole economy.
It really shows that criminal activity isn't just, street crime. It can happen at every level of society. Small-time scams all the way to massive corporate fraud.
It's like a whole different world of crime, but with serious consequences.
Yeah.
And, as we moved into the digital age, we've got this whole new frontier. Cybercrime.
Oh, absolutely. Cybercrime is exploding. I mean, as the book highlights, technology has given criminals new tools and techniques, and it's made it so much harder to track them down and prosecute them.
The book mentions this malware called SpyEye.
Yeah.
It can be used to steal your personal information, your banking details, all sorts of stuff. It's like a digital pickpocket, but it can reach millions of people.
Right. And that anonymity online, it makes it so difficult for law enforcement. It's a constant battle to keep up.
Kind of unsettling when you think about it. But, before we get too deep into cybercrime, let's take a step back and look at some of those crimes that really shocked the world, the ones that have just stayed with us.
Yeah, the book has a section called Crimes That Shocked the World. It covers all kinds of things, from assassinations to mass suicides to unsolved mysteries that still baffle investigators today.
Well, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, that's one that comes to mind immediately. Such a huge moment in American history. It changed everything.
The book goes into the conspiracy, what drove John Wilkes Booth to do it, and the political climate back then. It's a reminder of how fragile things can be, how one act can have these massive ripple effects.
And then there's the Jonestown Massacre, a horrific example of what can happen with cults. Over 900 people, a lot of them children, died in a mass suicide. Just awful.
It's a dark example of how charismatic leaders can take advantage of people, manipulating them into doing terrible things.
A reminder that we need to be critical thinkers, especially when it comes to groups that demand total obedience. And then there are the mysteries, like Malaysia Airlines Flight 370.
Vanished in 2014. No trace. Despite all the searching, we still don't know what happened. The book lays out the different theories, but it's still a puzzle.
These crimes that shocked the world, they stick with us, They make us fascinated, horrified, and they make us question humanity.
Yeah. They do. And that's something we're going to be looking at more in part 2 of our deep dive into the crime book.
We'll get deeper into some of these cases, look at the people who committed them, the ways investigators tried to solve them, or, tried to in some cases, and the impact these crimes have had on us.
So definitely stay tuned.
It's going to get really interesting. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of crime. We're looking at the crime book, and in this part, I want to focus on some of those really captivating cases. The ones that make you wonder, how could someone be so clever? Or so daring? Or, well, sometimes so ruthless?
It's like these cases, they show us the dark side of human nature, but also this incredible ingenuity, an understanding of how people think that can be, both fascinating and a little creepy.
Oh, for sure. Like Victor Lustig, for example. This guy was a con man. And the crime book talks about how he actually sold the Eiffel Tower. Not once, but twice.
Oh, I know, right? It's amazing. Lustig's story really shows the power of charisma, knowing how to deceive people, playing on their psychology. He knew how to tap into greed, ambition. He'd create these schemes that seemed believable, even though they were completely crazy.
Yeah, like fake government credentials saying the Eiffel Tower needed repairs.
It's funny when you think about it, but it also makes you realize how easy it is to fall for a good con.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a reminder that anyone can be a victim, no matter how smart you are or what your background is. These con artists, they're master manipulators. They know how to find your weak spots, what you desire, and they even use your trust and authority against you. Makes you wonder, how many people have been tricked over the years? I mean, before the internet, before social media, it must have been even easier to pull off these elaborate scams.
Right. Like the book mentions this guy, Harry Amela, back in 1926. He pretended to be a Prussian prince. This guy actually infiltrated high society, living the high life for months before he got caught. It just shows, I guess, the power of confidence, and a really well-crafted persona.
It's wild. Like something out of a movie. And speaking of blurring the lines between real and fake, the crime book also covers art forgery, which is, a whole other kind of criminal enterprise.
It's a fascinating one, too, because you need this combination of artistic talent, historical knowledge, and the ability to trick the experts. It talks about Elmire de Hory, who was this master art forger. He flooded the market with fakes, Picassos, Matisses, you name it.
Think about the guts it takes to create something that can fool art historians, collectors. I mean, it's like a high-stakes game of deception with millions of dollars on the line.
It really is. And it makes you ask, what is authenticity? What makes art valuable? If a fake is perfect, is it still a crime? Interesting questions.
Yeah, definitely. But let's shift gears for a second and talk about a crime that's fascinated people for decades. The D.B. Cooper hijacking. This is an unsolved mystery, and the book details it so well. It's full of twists and turns.
Well, the D.B. Cooper case. Classic. It was back in '71. A guy hijacked a plane, got a $200,000 ransom, and then he just parachuted out, vanished.
Gone. Poof. And no one knows what happened to him. Did he survive? Where did he go? It's like a giant question mark.
Exactly. And all those unanswered questions just make it more intriguing. The crime book presents all the facts, the evidence, the theories, and you can sort of decide for yourself.
Okay, so we've got con artists, art forgers, a mysterious skyjacker. But what about the really dark side of crime? The things that, really shock us, make us think about the potential for cruelty that humans have.
Yeah, unfortunately, history is filled with those kinds of acts, and the book looks at some of them, the ones that have left a real mark on society.
Well, like the assassination of President Lincoln.
Yeah.
The book talks about it as a turning point in American history. It wasn't just the death of a president. It really impacted the future of the country.
It does a deep dive into the conspiracy, why John Wilkes Booth did what he did, and the political atmosphere at the time. Really shows you how one event can change the course of things, and not always for the better.
And then you have cases like the Jonestown Massacre, which shows the dark side of cults. It's just awful. Over 900 people died in a mass suicide.
That case really makes you think about the psychology of cults, how these leaders can exploit people's weaknesses, their need to belong, and manipulate them into doing terrible things.
It makes you think about how important it is to be able to think for yourself, especially when you're dealing with groups that demand total obedience.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive. It's amazing to think, throughout history, as criminals have gotten more sophisticated, so have the ways we try to catch them.
It's like this constant back and forth, right? Yeah. Criminals trying to stay ahead, investigators trying to keep up, and the crime book really highlights that.
It does. And it's crazy to think that something as, base as fingerprints was a game changer. The book talks about the Stratton brothers case back in 1905, one of the first murder convictions in the UK using fingerprints.
Before fingerprints, it was mostly eyewitness accounts.
Right.
Circumstantial evidence, which, let's face it, can be really unreliable.
Yeah, people misremember things, they see things differently. But fingerprints, it was like science,
Exactly. A much more objective way to identify someone.
Wow.
And of course, that was just the beginning. I mean, look at where we are now with DNA analysis. I mean, that's become essential. The crime book uses the Colin Pitchfork case, and in that case, DNA evidence actually exonerated someone who had been wrongly accused.
So not only can it help convict the guilty, but it can clear the innocent. Amazing.
Exactly. And there are organizations, like the Innocence Project, that are dedicated to using DNA evidence to overturn wrongful convictions.
That's incredible. To use science to right those wrongs.
It's pretty amazing.
It is. But the book does bring up some of the, ethical questions about these forensic techniques.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, how far is too far when it comes to getting justice?
Right. That's always going to be a question as technology develops, Like, the book mentions lie detector tests, which, they're still pretty controversial, right? Some people think they're reliable, some don't.
Yeah, and then you have these DNA databases. Great for solving crimes, but it does raise privacy concerns. What happens to all that information?
Tough questions and no easy answers, but important to think about, to weigh the benefits against the risks, right?
Absolutely. But I think it's also important to remember the human side of this. The book talks about these dedicated investigators, the detectives who spend years trying to uncover the truth.
Yeah, like in the D.B. Cooper case or the Black Dahlia murder. I mean, these cases, some are solved, some aren't, but you see the dedication of the people trying to solve them.
Right, and it reminds you, behind every crime, there are real people. Victims, families, and those who are fighting to bring those responsible to justice.
It's easy to get caught up in the puzzle of it all, but there's always a human impact. Real lives affected by these crimes.
Well, this brings us to the end of our deep dive into the crime book. Big ideas, simply explained. It's been quite a journey. I mean, we've covered so much.
We have the history of crime, different types of criminals, how the justice system has evolved,
And why we're so drawn to these stories in the first place.
That's right.
And I think one of the biggest things I've realized is, crime is a reflection of us.
Yeah, of human nature, all the good and the bad.
Exactly. And unfortunately, crime is probably always going to be with us. But we're constantly finding new ways to fight it, understand it, and hopefully prevent it.
I think that's the key takeaway, for sure.
So if you're interested in learning more about this world, this fascinating world of crime, definitely check out the crime book. Big ideas simply explained. It's really thought-provoking, and you'll come away with a whole new perspective on things.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, that's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.